Hello, are you there? Can you hear me? We can't give all of you a microphone at the same time, but since you're all experts, you would all like to share your insights, right? Let us help you. This is how it works. Download the MSc app. Besides many other features, you can ask questions and participate in votings. To communicate with the panel, choose Interactive in the bottom menu. Select Ask the Speaker and enter your question. To participate in a voting, select the option Voting in the Interactive menu. After the poll is closed, you can see the results. You can use these features without having to log in. If you do log in, additional features await you, such as the most up-to-date participants list, the latest agenda, and a venue overview, and much more. We wish you a pleasant time at the MSc and many fruitful discussions.
Nur wir alle zusammen.
We will deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be.
We need to forge partnerships through mutual respect.
Перераспределяется баланс сил на огромном евразийском континенте.
The West, as a community of interests, of values, has been torn apart. The world at large is apparently becoming less Western. Westlessness is our way of describing a world that's becoming less Western and a West that's becoming less Western. It's my hope that we can come up with the way to take a specific problem forward.
First of all, we need to practice what we preach. And then the future of the West consists in going beyond the West. In a curious way, the future of the West depends on talking less about the West and more about the values and interests that actually unite a much wider group of states.
We do know what China wants to be in 20 years. We do know what Russia wants the world to be in 20 years. But we don't know what US, together with EU, as Euro-Atlantic community, wants to see itself in 20 years.
If you look at the most pressing challenges that we're faced with right now as a global community, whether it's Iran or terrorism or climate change, I mean, all of these are issues that will require a multilateral approach.
Climate change is a universal threat facing most of our countries. It is also a threat where, unless countries cooperate, the dangers will only escalate.
What an impressive crowd. This looks to me like the Munich Security Conference. I thought it's only starting tomorrow. So welcome to all of you. A very impressive crowd, full house, and an equally impressive panel. That's Munich Security Conference level. Former Secretary General of the United Nations, former Secretary of State of the United States, and very important other officials and prominent speakers. So welcome to all of you. I'm really excited that this town hall event, preceding the official opening under more restrictive security arrangements beginning tomorrow, has become a standard feature of our conference. It allows us to bring in people who are not normal participants, people from the Munich community, from the larger public. That's really great, and I want to thank our participants, our moderator, Edith, for having volunteered to talk to us this afternoon about security and climate. And I'm not going to take much of your time, but I did want to share one thought. Jennifer and I have had a bit of a conversation recently. She felt that maybe we weren't taking climate as seriously as we should. I think we've been successful in convincing you, Jennifer, that we are taking climate as seriously as we should. We've brought it to the main stage of the Munich Security Conference, and we will have not only this event this afternoon, but a number of other large and small events during this coming weekend. So I think it is now a fact that the international security community embraces the idea that climate needs to be regarded as an integral part of our considerations about how to shape the future of our societies, of the world. My very simple thought is that I would hope that as we, the security community, embrace climate as an important issue for us, I would hope that the climate activists would embrace security in the same intense manner. What I'm worried about is that some of you may not be fully aware that if one single big war were to break out anywhere on this globe, in particular, if one big war with nuclear weapons were to break out anywhere on this globe, all our wonderful calculations about how we're going to manage to remain below 2% temperature increase will go to the dustbin. In other words, I would hope that those of you who are excited and intensely interested in preserving our environment and working with our public, with our governments, to increase efforts to control the climate development, I hope that these groups will also develop an interest in the concepts that we've been dealing with over the last decades and years. Deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, etc., etc. I could go on and on. So this is what this conference is all about. It's about linking very, very different concepts with very different types of people, with CEOs, like the new chairman of DGAP, which is one of our partners for this event, who's been the president, the CEO of the largest non-American aircraft producer in the world, CEOs, experts, academics, elected politicians, international leaders from international institutions, foundations, and organizations, from energy through climate to global health. We will, of course, also be discussing through this weekend, in various parts of the weekend, the questions surrounding the coronavirus and how to combat and prevent future pandemic occurrences, whether it's here or in Asia or anywhere else. So having said this, I'm now going to turn over to our young friends from Junge DGAP to take over and then introduce the moderator, Edith, of the event. And I wish all of you a wonderfully interesting and exciting afternoon. Enjoy the Munich Security Conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ischinger, and yeah, welcome everyone, also on behalf of the Young DGAP. We are here tonight cooperating with MSC, who we also want to address a very warm thank you to, and we are the young organization of the German Council on Foreign politics, and tonight we want to discuss with you climate change as a security issue. And if you are interested in discussing topics like this, also other topics related to foreign politics, please feel free to join us at the Young DJIP. We are more than 1,000 members in all over Germany, and yeah, just visit us on the website, and I will hand over to Carsten Berger, who's head of the Young DJIP here in Munich.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Also from my side, a very warm welcome. It's a welcome which is hopefully much warmer than our climate in the future. Therefore, we discussed this very important topic tonight, or today, and I'm really, really happy to see so many people interested in this important topic. I personally don't want to talk more than it's necessary, because we have wonderful speakers tonight, and we have also a wonderful moderation by Edith Kimani, which I will please come to the floor. And once again, welcome everybody, and nice to meet you after if you want to continue talking about this topic with us. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So in 2007, as you remember, that's when you were Secretary General. I don't know what you've been doing since. In 2007, the UN Security Council held its first ever debate on climate change as a global security issue. Today, it sounds absurd that we had to wait until 2007. But since then, the world has seen a radical shift, I would call it, in thought on what climate change is and even how far-reaching those impacts can be. Now, in those 13 years, since that Security Conference debate, the Darfur Wars, which you aptly said, were actually the first, you described them rather, as the first climate conflict. The wars obviously followed a series of severe droughts. Now, whether you agree that climate conflict is a direct cause or is rather just a proximate cause of conflict, there is no denying that there is change within the nature of conflict, and there is conflict with nature. I'll repeat that because I read it at a World Economic Forum article, and I thought it was very impactful and quite captures what we're about to talk about right now. Change within the nature of conflict, and change and conflict rather with nature. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Edith Kimani, as you've heard. I'm from DW, that's Germany's international broadcaster. And together with the panel that I'm about to introduce, we're going to try and answer the question, Apocalypse Now, Climate and Security. So it's now my pleasure to invite my eminent panel on stage. I'm going to sit right here, and they will find their names on the seats. We'll start with Mr. Tom Middendorp. He is a General Chairman, International Military Council on Climate and Security, and also the former Chief of Defense of the Armed Forces for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Thank you for joining us. We're also joined by Helga Maria Schmid. She is the Secretary General, European External Action Service at the European Union. A man who certainly needs no introduction, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations and currently Deputy Chairman of the Elders Foundation. And you may have seen him exchange a warm hello with Secretary John Kerry, who obviously is the former Secretary of State in the United States of America. You'll notice that we have one seat which is empty, and that's because our last panelist is also acting as our challenger, and she'll begin the panel by giving us some brief remarks. This is Jennifer Morgan, the Executive Director, Greenpeace International.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here and to address you all, particularly with such an eminent and fantastic set of panelists to hear. I'm here as your challenger, and if you will, a representative of the millions of people around the world who care very much about these kinds of conversations. And to say the obvious in a way, that the climate crisis is a security crisis. The climate emergency is a global emergency. No nation, rich or poor, vulnerable or secure, none of us is safe. What we choose to do in the coming years is going to make a difference between life and death for millions of people around the world. And no one knows this better than the security community. And that's why I'm so very pleased, Ambassador, that there's such that we're starting with this topic today. I think the national security imperatives are rising as surely as the seas due to one thing, and that's climate change. According to the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, the #1 risk by impact and #2 by likelihood over the next 10 years is the failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. I think that's a short and dry way to describe a blood-chilling reality. What will failure look like? What will the world look like if we fail? I think we have to face that. And I'm an optimist. I am not a prophet of doom, as some may say, but we must acknowledge the reality. And according to the UN, the world is currently on a path to 3.2 degrees Celsius warming by 2100s, and this is a failure on an epic scale. This is a vision of the failure and the future that shakes me to my core and keeps me up at night, I'm sure like many of you here. It's a future plagued by insecurity of an unprecedented scale. A 2-degree warmer world will have 189 million people at risk of food insecurity than today. 388 million more people exposed to water scarcity. 194.5 million more people exposed to severe drought. In a 4-degree world, 1.8 billion additional people will be at risk of food insecurity, billions exposed to water security, extreme weather events, flood storms, and heat waves. And children are going to pay a heavy price. By 2040, 1 in 4 of the world's children will be living in areas of extremely high water stress. Cities will become unlivable, countrysides dry and bare, crops will fail, fishing stocks disappear, livelihoods collapse. Conflicts over resources will rip through communities. And millions of people are beyond the move, searching for safer ground. Already today, we're hitting record levels of displacement. An estimated 22 million people were internally displaced by natural disasters last year, mostly by extreme weather events, mostly floods, and those are modest numbers compared to future predictions. So national borders, as we know now them today, may become meaningless in the face of this mass movement. And if we fail, this is the future we will look at. Apocalypse indeed. I think military and foreign policy experts, including those of you here today, you know very well that healthy communities and stable human institutions are a precondition for peaceful societies, and the climate emergency threatens all of this. Militaries and intelligence services around the world look into the future, and they see increasingly severe events like extreme droughts, bringing about the collapse of entire nations. And even stable, rich societies are going to struggle. Look at Australia. Societies that already have weak institutions and limited means would be at risk of real collapse, and this will have global security consequences. So what needs to change? I just want to go through a couple of things. First, we have to accept that fossil fuels are a great threat to the stability and the future of our planet. Fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas have become the weapons of mass destruction. These dirty energy sources are the carbon bombs, and they are set to decimate our earthly home. Strong words, yes, I know. But we are now far beyond mincing our words. We're in a climate emergency, and few governments are acting as if they understand that. So to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to keep the world's remaining fossil fuels in the ground. That means moving away from coal, oil, and fossil gas and towards renewable energy. It's a simple message, but too few with power and influence seem to be listening right now. Dirty carbon bombs are found around the world, in the Arctic, many more available now due to the melting of the Arctic, in the oil reserves off the coast of Brazil, in the coal mining areas of Australia, in Argentina's huge oil and gas stocks, the list goes on. And let me be clear, these carbon bombs are exactly that. They are bombs that we need to be disposed of, and governments need to urgently rethink their approach to fossil fuels as the danger they pose is up there with nuclear weapons. It's a peace mission that I challenge you to engage with, and I think we know that fossil fuels have been fueling insecurity and conflicts around the world for decades. The quest for resources and conflict have gone hand in hand under the pretense of achieving a so-called energy security. Militaries have worldwide, they've been charged with securing access to those fossil fuels. And starting today, we have to start in a peace mission to limit their use and stop their further exploration for those fossil fuels that dominate debates. They must stay in the ground. Getting countries to 100% energy security through building up renewable energy and infrastructure, smart grids, that will be our true energy security. These are the peacemakers. I'm going to challenge the way that we think. These are the peacemakers we have to deploy. The wind turbines, the solar panels, if we want to create a safer world. So when we talk about disarmament, and my organization stands for both parts of its name, green and peace, we have to talk about a CO2 disarmament. The goal of foreign policy, a new climate peace policy, must be the creation of a new world order where the power of those weapons are reduced. And the Paris Agreement needs to guide the development of this peace policy. We have to create new alliances, take on new roles to achieve this mission. So in concrete terms, that means we need an active foreign policy for a global transformation of our energy systems, a generous development policy that ensures that state-of-the-art sustainable technologies are available to all countries worldwide, and a dramatic increase in the national commitments to increase action on climate change at the Paris Agreement this fall. CO2 disarmament, getting rid of those carbon bombs, must become a central goal of foreign policy. We need not spend more money on defense. We need to spend more money in this space, because all the weapons in the world are not going to protect you from the climate change impacts that are coming if we do not act. So it is not an investment in new weapons, but investment in wind turbines and solar plants and ecological agriculture and genuine protected areas for seas and forests that will create greater security. We need nothing more than a global Schumann Plan. We're sitting here in Germany, a Schumann Plan for the wind, solar, and the protection of biodiversity. And just as that Schumann Plan in 1850 laid the foundations for the later European Union, so today the foundation must be laid for a world that is climate and nature friendly, peaceful, and socially just. Quickly, in terms of Europe, well, I think we need a Europe that puts the mandate of the Paris Agreement at the heart of its actions. A Europe that sees the Paris Agreement as the basis for a global new world order. A world order of cooperation, which resolves conflicts together, which together takes care of those who are already suffering from climate change, which courageously opposes the preachers of hatred and exclusion, and which together calls to account those who, by clinging to a fossil fuel-based economic model, are endangering the security of all of us. To be able to overcome the climate crisis as a global crisis, we need more courage. Courage to demand a new world order, not just a higher price on CO2. And I think for many in this community, you know this. You know the connection of the climate and the security issue, and that's obvious. And that's obvious to the millions of people who are out in the streets, and they want to all live on a green and peaceful planet. So I trust that we're going to take the energy from this debate today and in the coming days, and that out of this security conference will come a message to people who are scared. Youth are scared. They want to see action, that this community is going to step it up, help develop that new global world order that we need. The first step are some unusual partnerships and unlikely allies, and I think that's the first step, and therefore I'm very grateful to have been here and to be able to share my thinking with you. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from the panel.
Director Morgan. Thank you very much. I definitely feel challenged. Actually, I feel slightly overwhelmed. So I'm just going to pass on to the audience to open this panel because you are part of this conversation. And we'll begin with a question to you all. It's a multiple choice question rather, and we'll get the answers on the screen and we'll ask the same question at the end of the panel and see if you've been swayed either way. And the question goes, what do you think is the most impactful risk posed by climate change to global stability? Is it A, armed conflict over natural resources, B, natural disasters, or C, mass displacement and loss of livelihoods? You use your app to give in your answers. I'll give you 1 minute to do that. I can repeat the question one more time. What do you think is the most impactful risk posed by climate change to global stability? Is it A, armed conflict over natural resources, B, natural disasters, and C, mass displacement and loss of livelihood? Okay, I guess we're going to close the voting there, and I will refresh the page and see what happens. Nothing has happened. There we go. So it looks like an overwhelming majority of you think that mass displacement and loss of livelihood is the biggest risk that climate change poses to global stability. And I want to ask our panel here. Secretary Kerry, how do you feel about that? Is this where you're at?
Where I'm at? Well, first of all, thank you for the privilege of being here with you. I'm delighted to be here with my friend Ban Ki-moon. We worked very, very hard on the Paris Agreement, and Helga. Helga was at the center of helping us to do the Iran nuclear agreement, which, when saner minds come back to power in America, we will come back to a more sane policy. So let me, you know, I have to put this in a context. I've been working on this for about 35 years. Al Gore, myself, a group of us in the Senate were the first people in 1988 who heard Jim Hansen, and then we went to Rio, and then we went to Kyoto, and then we went to countless places in the world for the Conference of the Parties. And I managed the Kyoto Agreement on the floor of the Senate. We couldn't move it because it was mandatory and because China wasn't doing enough. And so when I became Secretary of State, first thing I did, within 6 weeks, I went to China and met with President Xi to try to undo the damage that had been done in Copenhagen when we couldn't move forward. And we succeeded in getting President Xi to come on board. We worked together for a year. And finally, President Obama and President Xi were able to stand up in the Hall of the People and announce our intended reductions. And I think that was the moment when Paris was possible, came alive. Because China was at the table, and China brought the G77 with it. I have reached a point, I think I may be more militant than Jennifer, because no country in the world is getting the job done. And it infuriates me that these kids have to be out in the streets asking adults to be adults. We should be ashamed of ourselves all around the world. They're speaking conscience, but they're also speaking plain old common sense, folks. We are on a terrible, terrible course. And we need leadership that's going to stand up and really point out the degree to which we're behind. Every single country. We did the Paris Accord. I promise you, when we did the Paris Agreement, I said to the plenary session there, we're not guaranteeing to the planet that we're going to keep the Earth's temperature to 2 degrees centigrade. What we were doing was sending the most powerful signal we could summon from 196 countries to the marketplace and saying to the marketplace, we're all going to move in the same direction. And there's a vast market opening up for energy policy, for transportation, for new infrastructure. It is, by the way, the largest market the world has ever seen if we take advantage of it. There's a massive opportunity waiting for us. But guess what? Even if we did everything that we set out to do in the Paris Agreement, we're still rising to about 3.5, 3.7 degrees centigrade. Doesn't cut it. Talk about doing Paris doesn't cut it anymore. And the truth is, we're currently on course to hit somewhere in the 4s. You can talk to Johan Rockström at the Potsdam Institute or other scientists. We're heading into a massive march of lemmings over the cliff on a mass sort of suicide kind of agreement or pact here.
Okay,
but in difference, I'll come in and answer your question.
Yeah.
Every one of those things, every one of those three things is the possibility, my friends, because nobody knows exactly how it's going to break. When you have, I mean, if you think migration in Europe was difficult to manage because of Syria, wait till you have South Central Asia or the Horn of Africa failing utterly to be able to produce food or have enough water, and they're knocking on the door of Europe. And what's policy going to be then? So there's so much to get ahead of, and I think each and every one of those things, we're going to have massive damages. Ask anybody who analyzes this. Nick Stern, who's done a brilliant book about how the costs of inaction are much greater than the costs of action, but that's still not the way people are behaving. Europe's going up in emissions this year. The United States going up in emissions this year. India up, China up. China is funding some 25 gigawatts of new coal-fired power coming online at a time where no one in the world has a reason to be or should be rightfully building coal-fired power plants, period. But we're doing it. So you're going to have massive dislocation. You're going to have massive, we already have climate refugees. We have huge numbers of them. People don't watch it and count. 1 million of them, by the way, complicated our efforts in Syria because they came in from the desert during the Great Drought and changed the politics of Damascus and of the war. So all of this is already happening.
Okay, so let me bring in Secretary Moon here, because we've just heard that Secretary Kerry is pained that there are children who are having to go to the streets now. And the question is, if I was one of those kids, I'd be asking, what are the grown-ups doing? What aren't we getting right?
First of all, sitting together with Senator John Kerry, it brings me back to many, many years of hard negotiation. He was really one of the passionate, committed leaders to work together. If I may just say one episode, at the last minute when this Paris climate change was being adopted, one small Latin American country came out saying that we may not be in a position to agree. That means this 196 countries' views would have been killed. We were really trying to strangle the neck of this country. John Kerry and I, President Hollande, were really striving at the last minute. This really reminds me of all. He's still passionate, and I'm also very much grateful for your activism of Greenpeace. It's not only government officials or business leaders who are showing activism and passion. Greenpeace is one of the most actively engaging, and thank you, keep on going on that. As everybody knows, Paris climate change is not perfect. Nobody said it's perfect. It's still a lot of some weak points, but that was the most which we were able to agree upon at that time. But if we really implement this one, I think we will be much, much better. The 56% of migration, or forced migration, would be much, much more dangerous than military conflict. I think that is exactly right. This migration, forced migration, I think climate change is the key driver of bringing many people, pushing out of their homes, out of their countries. So we are seeing many, many migrants. Of course, Syrian crisis, etc., they're also driving people out of their countries. But if we do not address climate change, I think we have no hope. There are two most existential threats. That is, one may think it is nuclear war, but even more powerful, more disastrous consequences will be brought by climate change. These are one of the two most existential threats which we have to address urgently. Now we have really tried to depend upon young people I think like you and many other young people, without their activism, without their passion, without empowering them in climate road, I think we have no way, no future. Yeah. Thank you.
So this is a very positive panel, as you've just concluded. So I'd like to come to you, General Middendorp, because I want us to sort of set the scene. How bad is the situation really? And I know that in your time as a commander in South Afghanistan, you noticed that there was something peculiar happening in your war against the Taliban, which was connected to climate change. Can you please tell us about that?
Yes, well, thank you. And thank you for being here in this very distinguished panel. It's an honor for me. But I come from a different angle. I'm not a politician. I don't work on the world level. I come from the field. I've been in the military for 40 years of my life. I've seen many conflicts. I've been in the Cold War period, and I've been in many crisis areas. And I represent a new voice on this table. And that's the voice of the generals, the admirals, and security experts. And what I see now is a movement. They are linking up with each other. The network that we are building, the IMCCS network that I represent, is a network of many experts, senior military and civil experts. And they are shared, they link up because of one concern. And that concern is the future of this planet, and that concern is about the impact of climate change. That brings them together. They have seen what climate change can do. They have seen in conflicts that water shortages creates tensions in populations. They have seen that droughts pushes the people away from their homelands and from their farmlands and forces those people into the cities, into refugee camps, or into the hands of extremists. They have seen the impact of natural disasters, wiping away complete islands, destroying all the infrastructure. And they see the impact of the Arctic melting away and opening up a new geopolitical arena. And they are concerned. So for this group, climate change is a matter of global security. And I see more and more of these voices within the military and the security community coming up. And what we did is we organized that in this network, and we created a first annual World Security Report, World Climate and Security Report. And we looked at the different regions in the world and assessed how does climate change impact security in those regions. And the bottom line is...
Can you tell us what these regions were?
Sorry?
Can you tell us what these regions were that were in the report?
The future of?
The regions that you were reporting on.
Which region? Regions, yeah. No, sure, I'll go through the regions. What they see is that, for instance, in Asia, in the Indo-Asian region, there is an increased risk of floodings. There's a lot of population, mega cities, tens of millions of people living in cities, along rivers, on coastlines, threatened by floodings and by sea level rise. We see glaciers melting. And the melting of glaciers threatens the availability of drinking water for hundreds of millions of people. So you can imagine the impact that that will have also on the security. In the Americas, we see many increasing severe and extreme weather incidents. Wildfires, floodings, hurricanes, especially in the northern part of there. But we also see in the central and southern part of the Americas, we see fragility coming up more because of shortages in water. And Africa is, of course, to me, Africa is the canary in the coal mine. Africa is what we are going to see wider in the world. In Africa, the droughts are exactly doing what I just described. They are pushing the people away from the farmlands. They're pushing the herders, the farmers away into other areas. And that brings flows of people, and that also opens opportunities for other groupings like organized crime that do a lot of trafficking through those areas, and for extremist groups. So we are very concerned about this, and also concerned about the geopolitical impact. Because the Arctic area melting away opens up a new arena for geopolitical conflict. There's a lot of resources there on the ground, and we already witness a run on resources there.
Obviously, the EU is also concerned. Secretary Schmid, I just was looking through your Twitter account, and you said that the EU has invested a total of 8 billion for peace, security, and sustainable development in the Sahel alone since 2014, but you say that more is urgently needed to step up support for our G5 partners. Now, my question is, what more can be done? I mean, you've already intensified dialogue. We're talking about military training and investing more in sustainable energy production. What's left to be done?
No, actually, the EU has been really at the forefront, and it's not so much the issue when you talk about the link between climate change and security, if it is a direct threat to conflict. It's definitely a threat multiplier. And it was mentioned before, it was under your leadership when the Security Council first time debated the issue, the link between climate change and security. But for the European Union, we did already in 2008 a report, and I think we were the first ones to do it at that time, that established the link between climate change and security. And actually, I happened to be the penholder at the time on behalf of the High Representative Solana at the time, and I reread it on the way here, and it's still, I mean, it exactly describes what you have been saying, the fact that 1/5 of the population are living close to the coast or rivers, megacities. I mean, with rising sea levels, imagine what will happen. The Sahel, indeed, and 40% of all intrastate conflicts are over natural resources. And I agree with John Kerry. I think it's actually all the three factors that matter. What we have been doing, actually, and it's not enough, so we need to do more, on the link to security is to factor in the threat of climate change into our early warning systems, but not only do the analysis, then also go to early action. So we work with lots of countries around the world to actually help countries to improve natural resource management. In concrete terms, we have, for example, a project in Tanzania which actually helps develop climate-resilient seeds. So we have been reaching out to households all over the country actually to do that. We fund solar power, desalination plants, etc. But a lot more will need to be done. And this is why, and that will be my second point, Jennifer asked for the Schumann Plan. We have it. It's the Green Deal. This is the big project that was actually suggested by the new Commission. And this is really a transformative vision. We're well on track as European Union when it comes to the Paris Agreement, but we are a lot more ambitious than that. We want to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. This means we have to actually go a lot higher. But it's not only about reducing emissions or leading the energy transition. It's really about changing our lifestyle. It starts at home. It's about biodiversity. It's about putting an economy or a growth model to rest that's just based on fossil fuels, I agree with you, or on pollution. It's about protection of the oceans. It's about pesticides. It's really about, the President of the Commission said, it's really about changing the way we produce and changing the way we consume. And I think the young people have been leading the way on this and have probably given a wake-up call if it hadn't been necessary.
So changing the way we produce and consume is one thing, but how do we do it, Secretary Kerry, if people are still denying the existence of climate change? And I want to read something that happened during a congressional discussion when you were still in the Senate, that you were referred to as someone with a pseudoscience degree who's pushing pseudoscience. Going back to the question, how do we mitigate the impact?
I was testifying as the ex-Secretary of State, and I testified before one of our deniers. I regret to say to all of you that the United States is the single biggest home of climate deniers. And something has happened to us. I was in Madrid just a few weeks ago, where we again had not a kind of outcome we wanted. Why? 3 countries got in the way: Brazil, Australia, and the United States of America. Completely different from where we have been historically. I mean, we worked really hard to bring reluctant countries to the table. You know that. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, India, Poland. There were countries that just had to be dragged there, but we did. and there was a force in the unity. But when I was testifying before the Congress, a young Kentucky congressman challenged my bona fides to be able to make any judgment about science, because I didn't have a science degree. I had a political science degree from Yale University, and of course that didn't qualify me to make the judgment. I mean, the level of absurdity to that should grab all of you, which is why it went viral around the country, and it's where we are. But look, this struggle, we can go around and around a little bit here on sort of how we're going to approach this. You mentioned a moment ago, Edith, sort of a sense of, whoa, this is supposed to be an optimistic panel. I am optimistic. I'm just putting the truth on the table to tell you what's going to happen over the next 10 years if we don't do the things that we could do. As a motivation, hopefully the truth can still find a home in some places in today's politics in the world. But we have to honor the truth with respect to where we're going. 65 degrees, 64.9 to be precise, in Antarctica a few days ago. As secretary, I went to the Arctic. I flew over and landed on the glacier in the Greenland. I saw 86 million metric tons of ice falling off, calving every day to flow out to sea to melt. 86 million metric tons a day, just to get it in your heads, is enough water for greater New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey for an entire year, every day. So you can run around the world, you know, you see the 200 species we're losing a day, the bees that are used, that are critical to pollinating crops and things around the world, disappearing, 50% reduction, 3 billion birds gone from North America. I mean, run the list. How much do we need to begin to be able to make logical human conclusions about a trend line? Last January was the hottest January in human history. The last 5 years, the hottest 5 years in human history. Last 10 years, hottest 10 years in human history. The decade before that, second hottest. Decade before that, third hottest. So, you know, there's a point where we have to stop and say, what are we going to do? Now, I'll tell you, I've started a new organization called World War Zero, because I think we're at war. Now, am I at war? Are you at war yet? Not yet. But I got news for you. People are at war against you. There's a book out called The War on Science. And there is a war on science in America. A president who for years has said that climate change is a Chinese hoax. Now suddenly he sees the power of the voting booth. So what we need to do everywhere in the world today, there's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day coming up. We have to, all of us, be ready to go to those streets with young people, to hold politicians accountable, and to make it clear to the corporate world, the people who produce the products, that we're not going to stand for indifference. It's not going to be business as usual. Now, lots of people are doing amazingly good new things. I'm looking at a guy who's building trucks, hydrogen fuel. I think it could be the transformation away from the diesel engine. There are people pursuing still fusion. There are people pursuing, obviously, major automobile makers have set targets. But what's not happening, my friends, is a convening of power commensurate with the challenge that will bring us literally to declare war against the deniers, the protesters, the procrastinators, and the people who are declaring war on science, and win back the future by win back an incredible future. I mean, solar has gone 89% reduction. You're letting contracts now for 2 cents, 2.5 cents, 2.9 cents in places. The solutions are here. We haven't got the holy grail of battery storage where we need it yet, but we're getting there. It's moving. When we get to 5 days, 10, 20 days of battery storage, problem solved. It really is, because we take care of the base load requirements for companies and communities that need to be dealing when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. It's all doable. We need leadership that's summoning a global consortium. Let me put something to you. 82% of the G20 power today comes from fossil fuels. G20 provides 85% of all the emissions. And it is no wonder that small countries in Africa or in other parts of the world look at us when we're not doing it, and they say, why should we do it? So we have to set an example. In Paris, we agreed to have a $100 billion green climate fund. Why? To help these smaller nations leapfrog the mistakes of history and put the new power in place. But guess what? We've never had more than, I don't know, $5, $6, $7 billion in there, folks. $100 billion we're supposed to do. We spent $265 billion cleaning up after 3 storms in America: Harvey, Maria, and Irma. Irma first winds over 185 miles an hour sustained for 24 hours until Dorian came along. So we now have once in 500-year events happening every other year, every year. So what we need to do is have a kind of a war council. I don't know what else to call it. You know, there's a book out by Paul Kennedy, a professor at Yale, who wrote a book called Engineers of Victory. And it talked about how, and I go to a topic which no country has done more to come to grips with what happened in that war than Germany. So we always have been able to talk about it here openly. But in 1943, it wasn't clear that the Allies would win. There were key decisions that had to be made. And they were made, and many of them at a lower tech sort of level in government. That's what we need today. We need European leaders, America, the G20 should never be allowed to meet in a room without guaranteeing we have the $100 billion put in the bank now, and that we are going to proceed to wean ourselves from coal faster, and that we're going to set a much more reasonable way to bring the automobile manufacturers together. Get them all together. And sit down and say, okay, guys, what do you need to be able to transition to EV faster? How fast? Then you bring all your great construction companies of the world. How fast can we build out the infrastructure for the supercharging, for the charging, so families know they can get from here to there, and they have confidence to go buy an EV? By the way, we should be providing subsidy to lower income people who can't afford the high price of EV. You watch what that does to the marketplace. Moreover, anybody who's building an internal combustion engine car today can build an electric vehicle car of the future. We're just not imagining what this future can look like. And if we were, I think we'd have a lot more people converted and ready to move forward and do things. But there's no global vision for how you do that on the table right now. Everybody's sort of floundering around. Oh, you first, Alphonse, Gaston, you go first. And we have to all go first, folks. We have to do this together.
Director. Director Morgan, you would argue that one of the problems is the financiers, the banks who say that they are supporting the Paris Agreement, but behind closed doors, they're doing quite the contrary. What is the impact of that?
I think it's kind of one of the hidden things that happens. If you look at where banks are putting their money right now, it makes a big difference, right? If you have your bank out there investing in the types of solutions that Secretary Kerry is talking about, or in continued fossil fuels. And what Greenpeace found and published going into the Davos meeting was that there was a series of banks that have said they are for Paris and that they are Paris compliant, but they've actually continued to invest $1.4 billion in fossil fuels. And so I think it's pretty clear that voluntary arrangements aren't working. So we need to be looking at the risk that brings and have basically financial regulation. I think about it a little bit like the financial crisis from 2008, right? You can say, maybe the bankers can say then they didn't know about what was coming, maybe. But now they know very well what the risks are of the impacts across on the actual impacts themselves, as well as the risk of stranded assets that are happening. I mean, in the Netherlands, actually, you had a case that went to the Supreme Court, and the government now has been mandated by the Supreme Court to have a more ambitious climate target, and they just built brand new coal-fired power plants. That's a stranded asset. It can't stay there anymore. So I think what's really important, and maybe just, you kind of ask, why aren't things moving? And I think it's important to look at the things that are happening behind the scenes. And we're sitting here in Germany, and I read this piece a couple of days ago by Corrective, Frontal 24. I don't know if you all saw it. It's about a Heartland. It's called the Heartland Institute. It's an investigative piece on the machine that is behind deniers, the machine that is behind, since Lyndon B. Johnson was, president, that is behind bringing skepticism into the public domain. And who funds that? Who funds that? Well, it's the captains of the fossil fuel industry that fund that, and the banks that are continuing to fund that. So I think and take a look at it, because they work in Germany now. They work with the AfD. So if you're hearing more climate skepticism coming across the German airwaves, it's not by mistake. It's a very deliberate thing. And I think we have to get serious about what what the interests are that we're up against.
Yeah. And
really be looking forward to getting regulation getting there.
Secretary Kerry, you're looking at me like you want to say something.
This is part of the fight for accountability. I mean, democracies are obviously challenged everywhere. And there are many reasons why they're challenged. The fact that globalization has not been spread more evenly among populations, and the disparity in wealth, particularly in our country, which is a disgrace. And that's ripped people apart. But also, we're seeing cultural and tectonic changes taking place in societies, not smaller than, probably bigger in some cases than the Industrial Revolution, except that it's all happening at digital pace. And a lot of people just have trouble keeping up with it, but it's been complicated by what Jennifer is saying. There's another book I commend to all of you by Professor Naomi Oreskes at Harvard. She's a professor of the history of science. And she's written a book called The Merchants of Doubt. And it analyzes where the Heartland Institute, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the George C. Marshall Institute, all these things came from that have actually invested big money into stopping truth. And this goes back in our country. I'm just speaking about my country now. But Rachel Carson in 1962 inspired our generation with the Silent Spring. And that's when we held the first Earth Day, 1970. And when I came back from Vietnam in 1970, the first thing I did before I protested the war was to become part of Earth Day. And guess what? We brought 20 million Americans out of their homes. We had one day of unbelievable manifestation of unwillingness to live next to a toxic waste site. Didn't want to live in a city where you couldn't see from one side to the other. Didn't like the fact that a dump gave you cancer. And so we translated it into a political movement. We targeted the 12 worst votes in Congress. We labeled them the Dirty Dozen, which was then a big movie. And
still is.
Guess what? Still a big movie. And we beat 7 of the 12. So the survivors all said, oh my God, this is a voting issue. And guess what happened? We passed the Clean Air Act, safe drinking water, marine mammal protection, coastal zone management, endangered species, and we created the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States of America. We didn't even have one. It all happened in that burst of energy. But if you read those books I just said, you'll see how the same scientists show up going through the pesticide fight of Rachel Carson, the nicotine fight of R.J. Reynolds and smoking, the acid rain fight, and then into climate. And it's not that they thought they had to win. All they had to do is create doubt. You got to watch that in today's world of social media, et cetera, where we're losing the referees. We used to have referees. If you read the book, How Democracies Fail, one of the things that the author writes about is how the referees get taken away. And as the referees go away, suddenly authoritarian populism has greater ability to work its will. So this is all part of the same battle, my friends. Climate change is part of that battle. And we can't be indifferent to it. what World War Zero is trying to do, I have General Stanley McChrystal is with us. And I have Admiral Lee Gunn, who is the Chief of Policy and Planning at the Pentagon. So the military folks are stepping up. Security folks are stepping up, recognizing that they have a special voice to be able to share with, particularly in America. You know, they have a special credibility, and they can begin to change the conversation. It's about jobs. The jobs of the future. Fastest growing job in America is solar power technician. Second fastest growing job in America is wind power technician. And there are just tens of millions of jobs to be created in this building out a new smart grid, building out the transportation of the future, making our cities work more effectively. But you don't hear enough about it. And so people are hunkering down and being stolen away from the path of legitimate choice in a democratic future to the Salvinis and the, you know, right-wing sort of sellers of a complete and fraudulent set of possibilities. So this is the fight of our generation, my friends, and we really have to step up and win back the future and prove that democracy will hold those politicians accountable. And indeed, corporate entities, I think now are becoming much more sensitive to it. Larry Fink's letter for BlackRock saying we're going to consider all of these things in the context of climate. I think they should go further. I think when you look at the fact there's $1.9 trillion of money committed to future fossil fuel projects, and you see that 25% of all the coal-fired power plants being built in Asia, South America, and Africa are funded by China, and you realize China's bringing 121 gigawatts of coal-fired power online in the next few years, and India's not far behind. That's the fight, folks. That's what's happening. And if we're indifferent to it, we're not going to make it. But the alternative is, if we fight back and push back, the future is extraordinary in terms of better health, less cancer, less emphysema, less children being hospitalized for environmentally induced asthma. We spend $55 billion a year on that. Imagine if that went to the Green Climate Fund. So I'm sorry to work on, but I just think there is a connection here, which if we all go out of this conference and elsewhere and make it part of our daily lives to make sure political people, corporate chieftains, anybody who's an opinion leader is factoring climate into almost every choice we make. And if we do that, you know, we can get close to the goal. I'm not sure we can meet the 1.52 at this point, but we get close to certainly preventing the worst things from happening, which begin to get there as you get into the 2.5. And look at what's happening today. At 1 degree. We're at 1 degree now, moving towards the 1.5. So you already see what's happening. And you start getting in, I mean, it's Katie bar the door. They just had an article the other day in the paper that scientists have now noticed that the ocean currents have sped up. And they're sped up to a level that was at the worst projected possibility. They're already at the worst projected possibility. Now, I don't know the answer to all these things. I just know it's an ecosystem. I know that parts of it are dependent on other parts. And the precautionary principle suggests to me, we buy insurance for our home, we buy insurance for our car, we buy insurance for our health. We ain't buying insurance for the planet yet. And I think we got to get common sense back into our choices.
So let me ask Secretary Schmid. Secretary Kerry putting it really nicely. We buy insurance for everything. Why not for our planet? Are we ready as citizens, especially as the EU, to take and make those fundamental changes that are required to fulfill these dreams? I mean, we're talking about the Green Deal in Europe, farm to fork, and yet Germany is producing way more beef than it needs. Those farmers, are they willing to say, you know what, I'll spare myself $20 in order to save the planet?
I think the communication and the real public PR campaign is absolutely crucial. But I wanted to come back to something John Kerry said, because that's very important, because you really need to bring, and what Jennifer said, you really need to bring the finance world and business along. And that's why one of the initiatives we are supporting as European Union is actually the finance world. There is an international platform that is trying to define transparent labeling or categorizing of green financial products, so people actually know what they get. That's so important. Or we have more than 150 major companies now that have agreed to verifiable reduction targets. But you need to make the case, because of course many people say, well, that will cost a lot of money. Yes, the short term, there will be short term definitely an increase, but the long term gains are so huge. And for the EU, we are the Green Deal, of course, is not enough, because Europe only accounts for like 9% of global emissions. So that will not help. So we definitely need to work with others. And there are actually two strands here. One is we already now have quite a high percentage of the development cooperation we do is actually climate relevant. So it's already factored into our programs. But in future, we are suggesting to do more, so that actually a substantial part of our international cooperation, particularly with fragile countries, is climate relevant. But then we need to work with major powers. And of course, we all regret the US left. I mean, as you said, we were working on this together, and we hope that one day you will come back. But we still continue and work a lot with your states, for example, California and others, who are quite interested also in our knowledge when it comes to low carbon technologies. Or we do twinnings of cities in Europe and US. We work with Russia, for example. Our European Union embassy will do an important event in March, which brings together Russian business and others actually to work on precisely clean technology, share best practices. We work with China. And maybe this is another point I should say, is that I come from the foreign policy world, but there is no meeting these days, no foreign policy meeting where climate change is not in the agenda. The defense ministers of the European Union are discussing it. This is in relation to what Wolfgang Ischinger said in the beginning. The European foreign ministers had a long session in their monthly meeting in January to discuss climate diplomacy. Also, by the way, how to communicate, because you're absolutely right, communication is crucial.
So let me ask then, General Middendorp, how do we integrate these policy level discussions? We're talking about climatization of policy and operational level work.
Well, I think what we understand from this discussion is a great call for action. I think we all agree on that, is that we are facing a whole of society problem. And I think the military and the security community should be part of the solution. And I think there is a lot that they can do. They can do a lot in the preventive ways. They can help in early warning. We've got great intelligence services looking at the same fragile countries that we are looking at from a climate angle. So why not link them up, and why not join those massive efforts that are being done there to come to better understanding of what's going on? I think that the military can help being kind of a platform for innovation. Many of the innovations that Secretary Kerry just mentioned are also being incorporated in the military, and they have a history of being innovative and adaptive, so why not use them? Why not use that strength to build new technologies, to help develop new technologies? I think they can bring there too, but most of all, we need to climate-proof our policies, our plans, and our capabilities. And that's internally climate-proof so that we can work in new climate environments, but also towards fragile countries. So all the efforts we put into fragile countries, look at those efforts through climate eyes, and make sure that those plans contribute to solving the problem, contribute to building resilience in those countries. And also the military can work there. We have learned that over the last 10 years, to work more closely together with the development people, with the diplomats, to come to more comprehensive approaches, and to work on that together. And this climate proofing is what we all need to do in all the stovepipes, in all the agencies, all departments need to look to their plans through the eyes of climate and what can I contribute to solving the problem. And last but not least, I think that in the military we should use climate knowledge more in our training, in our education, to make people more aware. And I think there the military can help. They bring a professional voice to the table, a not political voice. So they can help build this awareness, they can help build this understanding and this sense of urgency. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a really detailed answer. Secretary Moon, I want to then ask about, we're talking about solutions and preventative measures, but what about those already affected? There are people who are permanently displaced in their countries. What do we do with them? Who gets to pay for their, replacement? What's the word?
Now, a lot of issues have been raised now. I'm deeply concerned and even angry that we have to repeat and repeat all we have been discussing so many years. Now even you raised the question of science skeptics. I think by this time, we should not talk about the science skeptics. It will only embolden some other people, like President Trump and some other countries in Australia. There are still some political leaders who would not try to believe in science. I think science has made it plainly clear that climate change is happening. This is what we are now witnessing. It's approaching much, much faster than one may think. Now, in that regard, I am deeply concerned and even angry by such a leader of the greatest country in this world, the United States, has withdrawn from climate change. And then I was also stunned, many of the G20 leaders were stunned when Prime Minister of Australia, Abbott, said that as a result of G20 summit meeting, he was saying that he believed that at least for coming 100 years, this coal power should be the important energy sources. Everybody was stunned. So this kind of logics or belief have always been clearly cut off by IPCC. IPCC is an organization of at least 2,500 world's best scientists, climatologists. They have made it quite clear in successive 5 assessment reports. And in addition to these 5 reports, 2018 October report, additional report, made it quite clear that unless we contain global temperature rise 1.5 degrees below, then we would have no hope. This is the science. This is a fact. That's why we should talk, waste all of our time talking about climate skeptics. Now, of course, we need to talk, as your question states, that how we have to address this one in the future. Financing. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, on behalf of European Union, United States, and Japan, proudly declared in 2009 in Copenhagen that we will provide $100 billion by 2020. 2020 is this year. By this time, we should have at least $100 billion. And then thereafter, $100 billion every year. This is a promise. What's the status of this Global Climate Fund, GCF? It's almost an empty shell now. Then there are many applications for assistance from developing countries. We need this project for adaptation, mitigation, and then they don't have much money, just a few $1 billion. This few $1 billion was what I really strive to arrange, mobilize before I left the United Nations. President Obama was very much forthcoming, and all European leaders were forthcoming now. But we have to make sure that from next year, at least $100 billion should be mobilized. I think European Union, when United States is not paying, we have to look to European Union now. Then use 21st science and technology. Use fully the 4th industrial revolution, artificial intelligence. There are many tools, means, but what is lacking is a political will. what kind of message are we going to speak to our young people, young generation? I think we have moral responsibility and political responsibility on the part of political leaders, starting from the United States. I'm sure that whatever may happen to presidential election in the United States, maybe after 4 years, in worst case, the United States will have to return to this climate process. Then US will lose their respect from international community. Because of their global leadership, people have been looking to the United States. People looking to the European Union. Now, European Union itself, they're also divided now. Therefore, at this time, what is most important thing is while we have to work for science, finance, and technology, at the same time, there should be unity, strengthening the multilateralism. So why this suddenly, all of a sudden, multilateralism, which has been the guiding principle, framework, since the end of Second World War, is now under attack. Why is it so? Because of the wrong perception, wrong vision of a leading country. Therefore, I'm really asking President Trump and the United States really look beyond their own problems. Now, what President Trump has made, I think it is scientifically wrong and politically short-sighted and morally, it's really irresponsible. That's what I'm really speaking out as a former Secretary General of the United Nations. Now for us, let us really transcend all political divisions. The nature does not count all care about our political divisions. I met Pope Francis last year. We were discussing about this issue. He said that God always forgives people. God always forgives. It may be so. A human being sometimes forgives, but nature never forgives. So before we are hit and affected by rational nature, I think we have to really look straight ahead with the global vision, global responsibility, mobilize strong partnership among government leaders, business communities, and civil societies. At this time, I'm asking particularly business leaders, they have a very important role to play. No country can mobilize such a big trillions of dollars. Only business communities, when they are committed, we can mobilize huge amount of money to address climate change. Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to come to Jennifer because of what you said in your conversation with the Pope, which eerily sounds a lot like Greta Thunberg, that nature does not forgive. And I'm wondering, where is the space for these young oncoming activists? Are they being involved in policy discussions? Do their voices actually mean anything, or are they just tokens?
I think these young climate activists have changed the debate in some places around the world. I think in this country, they're trying very hard. I think in Europe, you've seen it happen in elections, particularly in Western Europe, but in other places too. I think they've made people uncomfortable, their parents uncomfortable, which they should be. But I think it is wrong for us to put the responsibility of policymaking on them. They're 15, they're 18. That's our job. And I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I have to, being here in Germany, yes, we have to address the Chinese issue and the funding of fossil fuels. But in Germany right now, it is the main country holding back the Green Deal. Now, I think the Green Deal, okay, it's much broader, and it also does address the just transition, because we have to have a just transition for workers. Coal miners have given us great quality of life for many years, and they need to be, and it's not just the coal miners, it's many others as well. But we have the most important thing happening in Europe, and that links with the youth movement, is the Green Deal, which we think needs to be even more ambitious. It's a 55% reduction. It should be a 65% reduction. It needs to happen earlier, but Germany should be the driver to show how to get to a zero carbon economy by 2040. We need an example, and right now you have a new coal-fired power plant. Do you all know that there's, as part of the coal phase out, there's a new coal-fired power plant coming online in Germany, right? And so I want our audience here to understand that what matters, what happens here, it matters. And yes, we should all be taking on our own personal actions, eating less and better meat and dairy and using bikes and everything. Get engaged. Your voices are incredibly important. And I think we've seen what youth has done, but we have to take that forward. We have to help shift those power dynamics. And I think, you know, the inspiring statements of the Secretary General of where we need to go with multilateralism, and I think we do need a new world order, and I hope that the European Union can look to those new alliances because, you know, the carbon bombs I spoke about, those are real. And if you think about the amount of energy that goes into currently making sure that there's access to fossil fuels, we need that much of diplomatic energy going into making sure that they don't get extracted, right? So that Australia doesn't extract all that coal that Siemens is helping it extract, or et cetera. So I just, you know, Germany matters. Europe is the most important thing. This Green Deal is strengthening it, getting it through. We have to make that happen, because that gives you a base for an EU-China agreement under the German presidency in Leipzig to go into the next big meeting. And we need public engagement on that on all levels. And I guess just finally I'd say, I think, you know, youth, I found very interesting how they're engaging because, you know, they, the last thing that Greta Thunberg and others have done is actually put the finger on some companies, right? So if you look at their piece going into the Davos World Economic Forum, they talked about the financial sector and the need to immediately actually phase out funding for fossil fuels from those sectors. And I think that, especially in a country like Germany where the industrial sector plays such an important role, too big of a role, I think, in decision making, more and more exposing of that and engaging that, I think, is really absolutely fundamental. And, you know, as Secretary Kerry has said, we all need to be engaged right now. It matters. We all need to be having uncomfortable conversations, as our children are telling us we need to do.
All right, and speaking of public engagement, I now want to take in some questions. Yeah. I want to take some questions from the audience. I'll start with some which had been sent via the app, and then we'll take a couple from the floor. The first one I'll ask you, I suppose, Secretary Kerry. Is it even possible to fight climate change effectively without the USA?
No.
Quite simply.
No, we're 15% of all the world's emissions. China's 30 now. But any one country that would continue, I mean, there's several reasons for that. You lead by example, and we are responsible for 25% of all the quantified emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So I think we bear a responsibility for it, as well as it can't happen without it. Our economy is too big. We're the biggest economy in the world. If we don't begin to impress, I mean, this is where California has had an impact. We mentioned it earlier. California, freestanding, is the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. And when California sets up rules, which thank God it has, regarding the tailpipe emissions standards for cars, the rest of the country follows. It's not unlike the rest of the world, because we control the financial market place in terms of exchanges. We don't control it otherwise, but it's the locale of the exchange, and most currencies are pegged to the dollar. So our leadership is absolutely critical. That's why, by the way, with all due respect, Mr. Secretary General, there was no science involved in the decision President Trump made. He did not make a decision based on any science at all.
I actually wrote it down.
He made a decision based on his, you know, but can I mention one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Here's the other piece of why you can't do that. The feedback loops, which are the feedback of nature to us in their interconnectedness, are now telling us things that are even more of a warning, more of a flashing light. For example, the feedback loop of the opening of the ice in the Arctic, where we now have an iceless summer and free passage, is created much more dark water, which consumes much more light, therefore more warmth. 90% of the warming on Earth goes into the ocean, so it speeds up the melting of the ice. That's a feedback loop. The other one that may be the most really disturbing one is what's happening with the thawing of the tundra and the permafrost and the current levels of methane that are rising. You can light a match over water and the methane will light on fire. And methane is 20 times more damaging than CO2. It has a shorter life, but it's more damaging while it's in that life. And the life is long enough. When we're given only 10 years, its life is longer than that. So the augmentation of damage, we don't know how to control that, folks. That's a scientific feedback loop which is being ignored. So here's my take. I'm convinced, truly convinced, I see so much happening in technology at MIT, Caltech, in Europe, various places. And some people are exploring now what's called net technology, negative emissions technology, where you try to find ways to suck the carbon dioxide out of the air and put it to use. I was in Iceland recently and I saw a new company that is taking CO2, putting it into the basalt, a lot of basalt in Iceland, and it's mixed in some liquid, I don't know what it is, and it turns into rock. So they're talking about commercializing the negative emissions technology. And they're all and Iceland, by the way, is 100% renewable, mostly because it has this fantastic geothermal capacity. But here's what Iceland is doing. They're now in China, showing the Chinese how they could use geothermal, which they haven't done, and bringing their technology to them. So what I'm convinced of is we will get to a low carbon, no net carbon economy. We will get there. The question is, will we get there fast enough? A person like Tommy Remengensau, you remember our friend Tommy, he's the president of Palau. And Tommy, 15 years ago, was telling us, you know, I got to worry about my people, my nation state in the Pacific. And he was talking mitigation and adaptation. Now, there's only one thing he's talking about. Where is he going to move his nation? Yeah. Where do they go? No longer adaptation or mitigation. So we've squandered these years, folks. You know, and that's where the anger and frustration comes from for some of us who back in 1992 were in Rio, the first Earth Summit, and I just see this thing spinning, which is why I believe you have to basically have that war mentality. If you got the world on a war footing, and we're all agreed we're going to change this, then you bring trade into that negotiation so that you don't hurt companies. We don't get into a zero-sum game, which is what we're involved in this sort of, you know, back and forth now. You get into a, how do we make all of our workers gain as we go forward? Who takes the pain? At what rate do we have to take the pain, if there is pain? Mostly, folks, this is a better world if we do the things that are our tip. We have less go to the security issue. We are less dependent on a fossil fuel. The other day, President Trump said, I'm guarding the oil in Syria. Well, first of all, I don't know what right we have to be the ones to do that, but he's doing it. But if we don't have oil, then you don't have that kind of a struggle. If you don't have emissions, which are pollution, pollution is what drove the environment movement of the 1970s. We need to talk about this as pollution, which is what it is. And most people in the world don't want pollution. Most companies don't want to be affiliated with pollution. So I see a bright road ahead if we will come together and start making these joint decisions the way we did a few years ago to get a nuclear weapon off the table or to get the Paris Agreement passed. And one last comment on it. There is a bright side on what's happening in the United States, which is 38 states out of 50 have renewable portfolio laws that were put in place before our current president. Those laws require X amount of energy to be produced through alternative renewable. And they're moving in that direction. Republican and Democrat governors alike are still doing that. We have 1,200 mayors who remain committed to the Paris Agreement. So all in all, those 38 states and 1,200 mayors represent 80% of the population of the United States of America. So Donald Trump may have pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but I got news for you. The American people, mayors and governors, are still in Paris, and they're going to continue to move. It's just that Paris isn't enough anymore, folks. So let's get to the next step.
I'd like to ask General Middendorp here. There's a question which has been raised by the Research Vice President of Gartner, Annette Zimmermann, and she asks, what's the role that large technology organizations, giving examples here, Microsoft, Google, SAP, I'll go ahead and add Amazon, essentially non-state actors, what role should they play here, and what is the biggest threat to them if they don't help counter climate change? I'm asking you this because the military is also known for amazing and incredible technology. What can that do towards the fight against climate change and climate conflict?
Well, I think they can be a driver of change. They have a major role to play. It's, as I said, it's a whole of society problem, so we need the companies, we need the tech companies to step into this and to start making the change. And I see big chemical concerns already making a change towards more circular production of their products. And I think these industries can drive that change. And I also think that the military and the UN and NATO, they should lead by example also in the military operations. I've been in Mali, and it's a big UN operation. The first thing we do there, we build a super camp. The first thing we do in that super camp is we drill holes in the ground to extract groundwater. Oh, gosh. And what happens? The villages in the neighborhood run dry. So that's the impact that we have at this moment. The biggest fossil fuel consumer in any country is the military. So we have a responsibility to take. And I think it's a giant opportunity for the military to work together with these kind of companies to develop these new technologies. The biggest cost driver in any mission is logistics. The biggest risk factor in any mission is logistics. If you can become more self-sustaining in your operations, you can reduce that risk, you can reduce those costs, and you can put your money where it belongs, and that is bringing stability. So I think there is a lot to gain here. You can contribute to emission reductions and at the same time improve your operational effectiveness by finding these kinds of combinations.
I'd like to field some questions from the floor, please, yes? There's a microphone coming your way, just. If anyone else is interested, you can raise your hand and we can get a microphone to you. Second one and third one.
Thank you. My name is Johann Voss. I also represent the Young DJP, the young group of the German Council on Foreign Relations. And on behalf of the Young DJP and the DJP itself, whose president is also here, I very much thank all of you for this engaging discussion, especially for those lonely voices in today's foreign policy community who actually deeply care about climate protection. But when I look at kind of today's policy-making generation, one sees that there's obviously the need for school children to take more of a voice within this discussion. And I'm asking actually you, Jennifer, it's not the Oxfams and not the Greenpeace and not the one who currently lead the movement towards more climate action, but it's literally children and young people. And to what extent does this show that civil society in the way we currently organize it has failed, because it's not those organizations who currently make people in powerful positions sweat, but it's literally children and very, very young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan, for your question. We'll take two more and then we'll answer them.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Natalia Valeria Müller. I'm a grad student at the University of Vienna Department of International Development. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and to speak in front of you. My question goes out to Mr. John Kerry. As we all know, the US elections have been kicked off recently in the states of Iowa and New Hampshire with some Democratic candidates and very few Republican candidates. And my question to you is, who do you believe to be despite your personal endorsement of Vice President Biden, to be the most progressive candidate among them all, to transform America to the economy that you just described should be the goal for all the economies, to be green, to be efficient, and to be sustainable. Thank you.
Oh, there's someone on this other side.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Abdul, and I'm a student in LMU, Munich University. I study politics science. And I have two questions. Why we don't do disarmament when we know that the military is the biggest oil user and it has no contribution, sorry Mr. Middendorp, but it has no contribution to the environment, and you know that it's the most important thing. Why we don't do disarmament? And the second question is, which theory can explain the current situation? Institutionalism cannot or does not work. Or cooperation, constructivism is also not working. And what I see is neorealism, that every country seeks for its own security and for its own survival. But I hope that we can at least cooperate and communicate to each other. And then that's also, I'm happy that you are all here, and thank you for my...
So just as a clarification, the second one was a statement and not a question.
Yes.
Okay. All right, then let's start with Johan's question to you, Jennifer. He is essentially saying the children had to come to the fore because we had failed.
Well, I think that's part of the question. I think the question is really about the role of NGOs that have been around for a long time and been working at it, and then this youth movement that has come up, right? And I think that there's different levels of that. I think a Greenpeace or an Oxfam, or we will do things that others won't do, right? That puts pressure on corporations or on governments in ways that I wouldn't ask a youth activist to do. But we have activists who are ready to do that. We have, we have a global network that works around the world where oftentimes, unfortunately, youth aren't able to skip school and move forward, right? So if you look at the youth movement, it's actually my heroes and heroines are those who were in Korea, or in Japan, or in Uganda, if you look at what's happening there. But you need a mix, is what I think. We need all of it. And I think, Greenpeace gave over our whole social media channels to youth for their strikes because we think their voice is incredibly important, but we need to be doing the things that we need to do as well. And we need everybody. I think there's this word, this sense, are the big NGOs worried that their role is being taken over? No, I'm so incredibly grateful and incredibly inspired by young people. I also, like Secretary Kerry, feel incredibly terrible that they have to do this because we did fail, and it's not just civil society. I mean, you can put it on us, but frankly, it's the decision makers that haven't listened to the science for many, many years. And why haven't they listened? Well, look at the funding of campaigns if you want to talk about the US election. Look at the revolving door of politics in Germany, of who's in the government. So it's complex, but I think that we need everything. And I think it's incredibly important that in this country, the government and the companies start moving. I mean, youth have already had such an impact, but when you talk to them, they don't feel it. They don't feel it, but they've had huge impact. And you need to stay at it and have hope. And I guess just a quick thought on cooperation, because I actually think there is cooperation happening and collaboration happening around the world, but it's different. We need to think differently of the traditional, I hope we can keep that multilateral piece in, but the coalitions we need radical collaboration that goes across different actors in society to get emissions to zero. right? And yes, we would like to have everybody in, but I'm sorry, if there's a president in the White House that gets elected who is a climate denier, again, well then the European Union should put economic sanctions on that country and build coalitions with other countries because it's at their risk, right? So I don't want us to be like hampered by a mindset from back then. We need to be dynamic and we need to work with whoever we need to work with to get this done.
Okay, Secretary Moon wanted to add something to that.
Let me add to the question about children. I think that's a very important question. And adding to what Jennifer said, for 10 years, and even after retirement, 3 years, for 13 years, I've been speaking only to established group of people, political leaders, business leaders, and civil society. They are all grown-up people, established people. Now I realize that it would be much more important at this time that we need to educate the young children. That's what I realized. It may be too late, but never too late. So I'm now making some campaign of educating children on environment issues. Political leaders are changing. They are leaving and coming. So by the time when I have talked to them, then they are gone. So we have to repeat and repeat. And political leaders all come from different political perspectives. Now my suggestion and strong suggestion to all of the member states of the United Nations, particularly education ministers, I think we need to start educating from elementary to middle and high school about the importance of the environment. They must know, because this world will be led by them soon. It's a matter of just 12 years. In that regard, the Italian government announced very important, inspiring decision. November last year, the education minister of Italy has announced that from this year, all the students, starting from elementary to high school, they will have to go through 33 hours annually, education, curriculum on environment and climate change. This is very important. Then, inspired by this, I'm now speaking to many member states, including from Korea and China and some Asian countries. I'm really asking European Union, particularly you, very important group of countries, if you raise this kind of issue at the European Union level, and each and every one, who may have some connections or role to do with the education, I think this will be very, very important subject which we have to think about before we argue all the times with political leaders.
Yeah. Thank you, Secretary Moon. I think it's clear throughout this conversation that we need a multiplicity of solutions. And so to Natalia's question about a zero-emission economy, and I think she wants to know specifically who you think the person would be to get the US there.
Well, I'm not joking when I say to you that any single one of the Democratic candidates will be better than what we have today. Obviously, a couple of them have had more to do with climate. I mean, Mike Bloomberg obviously has been enormously engaged in climate with effect, and others. But I'm going to try not to bring the horror of the election to Munich over this weekend.
It's too late. The question has been asked.
It's been asked. I know, but I'm not going all that deep into it. I want to just say something about that gentleman's question about, quote, not about disarmament, which I don't think I need to say, but cooperation. There is you inevitably learn, hopefully if you keep your mind open, you learn even when you're in a position of high responsibility. And I did as Secretary of State, and one of the things I learned was the degree to which certain countries that have been part of the post-war structure front and center, particularly the PERM 5 at the UN, are really indispensable to being able to get certain things done. I'll give you an example. I remember sitting in the Situation Room of the White House one day, and we were told 1 million people are going to die in the next 4 months unless we do something about Ebola in West Africa. And we really didn't know what we didn't know. And it's just an honest admission. But we found out fast. We really went at it. And the President Obama, had the courage to send 4,000 troops to West Africa. And here's an example of what General Middendorp is talking about. The military is going to be our execution entity for an awful lot of things that are not pure military jobs, but which will prevent conflict and will be critical to our ability to meet certain challenges, particularly if we have more intensive weather events. So we cooperated with the British and the French and ourselves and with the Secretary. We had an emergency meeting at the UN, which you recall. We brought Japan and China and everybody to the table, and we relied on Japan for those suits that keep you protected, and China helped provide health people and so forth. It was cooperative. And in 4 months, by Christmas, we stopped Ebola in its tracks in 3 countries, each country taking a country, but coordinating, and a fraction of the prediction died. Now, AIDS in Africa, we've been, for the last 20 years, deeply involved in trying to help bring antiretroviral drugs to South Africa. And Bill Gates has helped. It's been a public-private partnership. We're on the brink of the first generation of children being born AIDS-free in Africa because of that effort. It's a multilateral effort, folks. That's why I get so upset and angry at our, at the discussion about people taking care of themselves and hunkering down. We will not deal with the problems of the world, whatever they are: extremism, terrorism, cyber, nuclear, chemicals, unless we come together. If you didn't have a UN, you'd have to invent the UN. And the fact is that what we created in post-World War Europe, with the financial institutions, with the IFIs that help less developed countries, with the health organization, with the, run the list, folks. Highest standard of living in the world is where? Europe. Best incomes, Europe. Best health system in the world, Europe. Run the list. So people need to start shaking themselves a little bit and get out of this easy reaction to globalization that hasn't rewarded enough of the workers and people who are angry. But if you start taking care of that, we will all recognize the only way to deal with climate change, the only way to deal with transboundary disease, the only way to deal with extremism is for us to work together multilaterally. And we need to get leaders who are going to commit to that. Only way.
I will take one more question from the app and 2 from the floor. If you've got one at the front, let's take another one from the back, please. Oh, and because you shot your hands so powerfully. So the question on the app: what is the one thing you think the European Union should incorporate in its foreign policy making, and why? Secretary Schmid. What is the one thing you think the EU should incorporate in its foreign policy making, and why?
I think we have one open question.
We had one to you, of course. Yeah, which you can take up to this. I'm sorry about that.
I would be happy to do so, yeah. You asked about why do we need a military? And can't we put that money that we pay to the military, can't we put that into these kind of efforts? And I wish that was true. To be honest, I would sacrifice my life for a world where we wouldn't need a military.
Really?
I've been in many conflicts, and I've seen the price of conflicts. And I would give my hand if we can avoid conflicts. So the more we can do that, the more we can make ourselves abundant, the better it is for me. But in reality, there is friction. And especially in fragile states, when security levels and security institutions are poor, you see that friction easily flame up into conflicts. And climate is accelerating that. And that's why we need the military. I think the military is needed to help build that resilience that we are looking for, also in regard to climate change. If I look at all the missions that I've done, 90% or more were preventive in nature. Was just to safeguard a situation from not escalating. Make sure that parties stay put and they didn't go to fight. And that's what the military can bring, because if we look at the impacts of climate change, we see more scarcity. And scarcity is a source of friction and conflict. And I think the military needs to help to make sure that we become more resilient to deal with these kind of challenges.
Thank you very much, General. That was very helpful. Thank you. I hope the gentleman who asked the question, sorry I didn't catch your name, I hope you're satisfied with the answer. Okay, your question now. What is the one thing you think the European Union should incorporate in its foreign policy making, I suppose, with regard to climate change and conflict, and why?
Actually, it's happening, and this is indeed conflict prevention, early warning conflict prevention. And here I think it's very much in the same vein you said. The European Union is currently running 16 operations, most of them civilian, but we also do military operations. And we work very closely with NATO, and I think the idea is really to stabilize post-conflict situations, but also to increase resilience, but also to make sure that there is peace, preserve peace. This is more our civilian missions, also make sure that peace returns. And that's why, and this is in relation to the question also, there is also a role for the military. Yes, we also factor in climate change, indeed in our mission mandates. We make sure that we boost energy efficiency, we protect the environment, but particularly in a situation where you will see more and more hurricanes, natural disasters, you may need the military, particularly in countries where the civilian capacities are not enough. So civil-military cooperation is important. And the other part is, and this maybe relates to what the Secretary General said, is education. I would go beyond Europe. I mean, what we are doing, and there is a lot of international cooperation. We have it's called the Global Climate Change Alliance, and we support projects in more than 70 countries, and a lot is also about establishing the nexus not only between security and development, but also education. I give you one good example, is take Lake Chad. Lake Chad has been shrinking like 90% in the last 4 decades. So it used to be the livelihood for 30 million people. Now what's happening there is the men are leaving, and also there's a point about men and women who are differently affected. And this is why women's empowerment is so important, and I'll come to that. So the men are leaving, there's a competition over resources, it becomes a breeding ground for radicalism. Boko Haram is benefiting from that. And so what do you do in that situation? So what we have been promoting is actually education, workshops, empowerment of women. And there's a very nice story of a young woman actually who has been leading an initiative to combine the results of modern science, modern technology, with the more traditional ways of preserving water. And that has been really successful. But education is key, and empowerment of women, also because women are really agents for change, also when it comes to promoting low-carbon lifestyles everywhere, not only in Europe, so everywhere in the world. So I would very much agree with that on education. I think that is probably we need to factor in even more. And as I have the floor, last point, I would also agree with Jennifer, because I think the role of civil society, the young people, has been absolutely important, but it's really and you're right, the commitment, the obligation of governments. And here I'm optimistic on the Green Deal, because the Green Deal is not just a one-time project now, it's 50 different actions, it's a process that has been launched, and I can tell you in Brussels we will not let governments off the hook, so we will definitely make sure this will happen in the next years.
I'll definitely hold you to that statement. I'll come back a couple of years from now and we'll review. So the questions that had been... October. Sorry, where are the questions? Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion. My name is Vasek Natov. I'm a PhD candidate at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society at LMU. And I do have a question for all of you. and I'll try to keep it short. I've recognized you've all acknowledged the climate emergency as a global phenomenon, posing serious risks to security and stability worldwide, and it should be definitely addressed as such, as a global phenomenon. Do you believe the world as a whole or the international system has the right mechanisms or institutions to face this crisis on the global level? Should already existing mechanisms or institutions be strengthened, or should we already be envisioning new structures to deal with it, and a new leadership, or even a new world order? Thank you.
We had another question at the back and a final one to the right here.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Thanks for taking my question. My name is Tim, and I would like to direct this question to Mr. Moon. It is pretty specific, but will get broader in the end, so bear with me. A lot of is said about migration in Europe, and it is a horror scenario, what is going on in Turkey and in Greece. But I would like to shift the focus a little bit more to Asia, and thinking about a scenario in which, as Mr. Kerry already said, in Palau, an entire nation needs to be delocated. Think about Indonesia or the Philippines. Now think about what is the most likely country to go to. It is China. And on the other hand, we have China, a state in which a state-induced discrimination for Uyghurs or an indoctrinized population is facing then, how should I say, a massive crowd of immigrants. How do you see this melting pot of people getting together, especially sadly to say that immigrants are sometimes viewed as cheap labor, and cheap labor in China facing off cheap labor from climate refugees. And I would like to get your opinion on how this could develop, and in a more broader sense, how institutions like the UN could mitigate or try to intervene with governments, making them more open to climate-induced immigration, and also helping societies to overcome the barriers in thinking. Thank you very much.
And a final one from the back.
Thank you. This question is directed to Mr. Moon and Mr. Kerry. My name is Carmen Robinson. I'm an environmental engineering student at the TUM, and so I wanted to ask you what everyone is afraid of, because honestly, I'm not afraid of climate change. I know we can tackle it. I am afraid of the lack of action on the political level internationally, and I want to know what global leaders are waiting for to actually implement laws and policy that is effective against this, because it just seems to me like we're afraid of big companies and are afraid they're going to pull the monies out and change the where they're paying their taxes, and I don't think Facebook or Amazon are going to save us when we're all drowning. Thank you.
Okay, let's begin with that last one for the two secretaries here. Implementation. Do we need to go back to what we heard earlier from Jennifer, that perhaps we need punitive measures against countries that, don't follow up what they agree on? We can start with you, Secretary Moon.
Let me answer some of the questions raised to me. I think we are going into some political questions. Before that, I'd like to, it's always embarrassing that people are mixing up my name. So two persons address me Mr. Moon, but my last name is Mr. Pan, in fact. In Korea, we put the surname first. When it comes to Chinese people, there is absolutely no confusion. They know that the first written name is a surname. In Korea, the first written name is a surname, but in English expression, it's coming in back and forth like this way. It may be responsibility of Korean people because they mix up like this way, but I just want to stick to the way Korean people call me. Now, about how to handle this climate issue and other global challenges, you may think about another institutions, like why United Nations is not able to handle this matter. Of course, morally, after retirement, I'm responsible. At this time, the United Nations is now more under attack. international organizations are in disarray. It's not because, of course, nobody said that United Nations is a perfect organization. There are weaknesses. There are some problems to reform. That's what I have been doing energetically during the last 10 years. We improved a lot. But it matters, it's coming from member states. It's a member state. It's not, the United Nations is not owned by the United Nations staff. It is owned by the member states. It's your organization. Each and every one of you are coming from one of 193 member states. When you don't care about the United Nations, when you don't care about your own children, then who will look after your children? It's your children, your baby. So it's, I think you have to do. Of course, that does not mean that we are not doing anything. I think I have been doing a lot to really improve transparency, accountability, efficiency. All this what I have been doing. But at this time, if you, because of frustrations caused by this lack of progress in climate change or other global issues, if you blame United Nations, I think United Nations will become more and more weaker and powerless. This is not the answer. I think you have to really care about the United Nations. European Union is also, with the Brexit, a little bit signs of division. But if you don't care, your organization, then there is no answer. This is my frank view on this time. At this time, now about the Chinese issue, these are domestic issues now, but it has some political implications at that time. But I think it's not only the China, but there are many developing countries who are sending their people for better opportunities. A lot of migrants for the purpose of better opportunities like jobs. In European continent, you have so many such people now. And it's not only China, the many all throughout Asia, even in South Korea, we have many foreign workers. Then how to protect their human dignity and human rights, that is a very important one. The United Nations really care. It's a matter of human rights and human dignity. And all the people, whatever you may be, whether you are a worker or you are a visitor or just staying there, I think this is most important value and principle. I think this is something which UN Human Rights Council or United Nations General Assembly will have to continuously raise the attention to the member state. It's absolutely important that their human rights, human dignity should fully respected. When it comes to sort of what you call cheap labor, they are the most vulnerable group of people. If we don't care, I think your citizens, our citizens, must care for their dignity. If not well-being, if not the I think they are not working for well-to-do like this way. At least they are really trying to earn minimum wages. That is a continuing priority of the United Nations.
Secretary, but please allow me to interject so that we can have one more answer, and as we are out of time. Secretary Kerry, Mr. Ban has been very good at answering the question of institutions and implementations. What about the issue of climate refugees, the ones that we are anticipating might leave their countries, who are already leaving their countries? What's the pressure for the West?
Well, first of all, you left me completely confused about your name. I'm going to call you Key now. That's much easier. I got to weave into that answer an answer to the question about the lack of leadership and about companies not moving and why we're where we are. And it's a really fascinating, we have to try to understand it in order to understand where we're going to go and how we get there. And I think a young woman back there asked the question. I think that, first of all, I keep hearing from our friends here, we haven't failed yet. We've failed to date. We've failed to summon what's available. We've failed to get ahead of the curve. We have failed to mobilize in a sensible way 20 years ago for a lot of different reasons. But we haven't failed on the subject of actually doing what needs to be done on climate change. What ought to be motivating to us is the fact that these young kids, climate strike, by the way, on World War Zero, we have climate strike, Fridays for Future, and Sunrise Movement and other players all involved. It's critical. We're not going to do this alone. But I got news for you. If you're 10 years old today or 8 years old today and you're demonstrating, or 11 years old, the likelihood that you're going to be in a position to actually make a decision in Congress or in a parliament or in Europe or in a boardroom, not going to happen. This entirely falls on us, folks. When the scientists tell us that the next 12 years, and that was 2 years ago, now 10 years, are the critical years to be able to prevent going over the 2 degrees. And so that's the challenge, is really this 8-year period. And I don't think it's, you say, why does it not happen? I think it's pretty obvious why it doesn't happen. A combination of money, greed, power, indifference, ignorance of facts, and perceived self-interest, which may be perhaps the most powerful. Perceived self-interest. And we have to change that perception of the self-interest. It's what I told you about. It's why I bored you with taking you back to 1970 about Earth Day. We changed the perceived self-interest. The perceived self-interest became survival in office. In the last election in the United States, when we wound up with a president who doesn't know anything about climate change, we had only 19% of people between the ages of 18 and 25 bothered to vote. Whoa, are you kidding me? 19%. It went up to 31% in the midterm election when we won back the House. But that still means 69% didn't vote. Now, you want the future? 70% of Americans say they're concerned about climate change. And my message to that 70% is get off your ass, go out and do the work of democracy and hold people accountable. Yep. That's what we have to do. It's simple. So I watched the US Senate change starting in 1994, and it's not that the rules changed, it's that the people changed. The UN can work. It did. We did big things. We've done them over years now. There's no less a willingness or appetite to do that today, but here's part of what's changed: geopolitics. President Putin and President Xi are very busy marketing a narrative of their interest. It is that the West is failing, the West is in decline, their model of authoritarian decision-making, instantaneous decision is better, and that this is not the American century, this is going to be the Asian or Russo-Asian, Sino-Soviet, whatever you want to call it, century. So, folks, that's the challenge here, is for us to believe in sort of what we have and in the power of individuals to make a difference. I think those kids are setting an example there, too. You know, I'm a child of the 60s, and I grew up when we did the civil rights movement, the voting rights movement, the environment movement, the peace movement, the women's movement, all of which did great things to change America. Title IX for women, I mean, I can run through a long list. That's where we have to go right now, all around the world, with people who recognize the need to be able to come together to solve this problem. And you asked if we need penalties. Yeah, we do. but you got to get them. You got to pass them. You got to agree on what they're going to be. You've got to agree on who's going to levy them. And right now, we can't get that kind of agreement. We have no capacity to be able to set up that structure. So we really have to rely on a leadership that brings people together and makes it very difficult for leaders in other nations to be scofflaws or to move in a different direction. We have our own huge accountability moment coming up in November of this year. Others of you have accountability moments coming up at different moments. But if we're all moving in the same direction, I really think we have time to be able to make the changes. And what's interesting is now, the private sector has really gotten that message that we tried to send in Paris. They're there. They're really there. And they see an awful lot of money to be made. The fact is that right now we're looking at the potential of a $2.5 to $4.8 trillion climate gap in the next 10 years. So massive investment, I think, is going to begin to move for the simple reason that people go, whoa, there's a lot of money to be made in emissions-free trucks. As Europe sets the standards, you watch the rush of the private sector to try to fill that demand. Supply and demand is going to work in a big way here. So I think we have to have some confidence about this and try to figure out how we get the leaders to come together to get tougher in holding themselves accountable. And just think, 85% of the emissions, as I mentioned earlier, are in 20 countries. That's manageable. Bring those 20 countries together. We used to meet them. They're called the major emitters. And as we led up to the Paris Agreement, we would meet with the Major Emitters Forum once, twice a year, 2 or 3 times, I guess. And we worked on the formula for how do we all do this in a way that everybody can feel they're not paying the price alone and everybody's in it together. I think hopefully by massive engagement by citizens around the planet over this year, we can change the politics in the way we need to.
That's an incredibly positive note to end this panel. Thank you. Yeah. Truly, that was incredibly positive. What a wonderful note to end on, which saddens me to bring the very sobering question I started this panel with back to you, dear audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I began by asking a question which I will repeat. What do you think is the most impactful risk posed by climate change to global stability? Please let me know on the app and we'll see if anything has changed since our discussion began. What do you think is the most impactful risk posed by climate change to global stability? Armed conflict over natural resources, natural disasters, or mass displacement and loss of livelihood? Okay, let's see if technology complies this time. Wow. Have we said nothing convincing to you this whole afternoon? Well, it looks like it's pretty much where we started off, that mass displacement and loss of livelihood, according to you all, is what you think is the most impactful risk posed by climate change to global stability. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation. And of course, we wouldn't be here without our esteemed panel. And so I'd like you to help me put your hands together for them and for their participation. Jennifer Morgan, Tom Middendorp, Helga Maria Schmid, Ban Ki-moon, and John Kerry. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.